Before we continue tonight's journey, I'd like to mention one small thing. If this is your very first time joining us, I highly recommend beginning with part 1 of the Odyssey explained slowly. That's where we explored the fall of Troy, met Odysseus for the first time, witnessed his encounters with the Chacones, the Lotus Eaters, the terrifying Cyclops, Polyphemus, and followed his heartbreaking meeting with Aeaea, keeper of the winds. Those events lay the foundation for everything that follows tonight, so if you haven't heard them yet, you may enjoy starting there before continuing this adventure. But if you've already traveled with us through the first part, then welcome back. Settle into a comfortable position, dim the lights if you wish, and allow yourself to relax once more. Tonight, our voyage resumes exactly where we left it. Odysseus and his weary companions have once again been cast out upon the endless sea, farther from home than ever before. The hope of reaching Ithaca had slipped through their fingers, carried away by the very winds that were meant to guide them home. Ahead lies an even stranger world one, filled with towering giants, powerful sorceresses, mysterious lands beyond the edge of the living world, and dangers that have echoed through mythology for nearly 3,000 years. So, as always, take a slow, deep breath, let the worries of the day drift quietly away, and together let's continue one of the greatest journeys ever told. This is the Odyssey explained slowly, part 2. The sea remained unusually calm during the days that followed their departure from the island of Aeaea. Yet no one aboard Odysseus' fleet could find peace within themselves. The waves rolled gently beneath the ships, the sails caught a steady breeze, and the endless blue horizon stretched in every direction exactly as it had countless times before. Nature itself seemed almost indifferent to the sorrow carried by the weary Greeks. Only a short time earlier they had stood within sight of Ithaca, close enough to imagine the smoke rising from their own homes, close enough to believe that 20 long years of suffering had finally reached their end. Yet through a single moment of mistrust, everything had been lost. The miraculous gift of Aeaea had vanished forever, and with it disappeared the easiest path home they would ever receive. Homer rarely lingers upon loud expressions of grief, but instead allows silence to tell the story. The sailors no longer laughed together beneath the stars. Conversations that had once been filled with hopeful dreams of wives, children, and familiar villages gradually faded into long stretches of quiet rowing. Even Odysseus himself seemed changed. Though he continued to lead with determination, he now carried a heavier burden than ever before. Leadership, he understood, was no longer simply about finding the correct course across the sea. It had become a struggle to keep hope alive among men who had begun believing that the gods themselves wished them never to return home. Ancient Greek audiences would have recognized this feeling immediately. To them, fate was not always fair, nor was it always understandable. A person might act wisely and still suffer. Another might behave foolishly and yet enjoy success. The gods did not owe humanity explanations. Mortals could only continue forward, trusting that perseverance itself possessed value, even when the destination remained hidden beyond the horizon. Several days later, strange mountains slowly emerged from the morning mist. Unlike the rocky islands the Greeks had visited before, these cliffs rose almost vertically from the sea, their towering walls enclosing an unusually narrow entrance leading toward what appeared to be a perfectly sheltered harbor. It looked almost too peaceful to be real. High stone walls surrounded the water on every side, protecting it completely. from the open sea beyond, no waves crashed against the shoreline. No strong winds disturbed the surface. Even the cries of seabirds seemed strangely absent. Homer describes the place as possessing an eerie stillness unlike anywhere else Odysseus had visited. Modern historians have often suggested that this mysterious harbor may have been inspired by unusual coastal formations familiar to Bronze Age sailors, where steep cliffs created naturally protected anchorages. Whether Homer based the description upon a real location or entirely upon imagination remains impossible to know, but the symbolism is unmistakable. Throughout the Odyssey, places that appear perfectly safe often conceal the greatest danger. Ancient listeners would already have sensed that something about this peaceful harbor felt deeply unnatural. The entrance was so narrow that only a small opening connected it to the open sea, while sheer cliffs rose on either side like enormous fortress walls. Most of the Greek captains, exhausted after months of wandering, welcomed the opportunity to anchor in such calm waters. 11 of the 12 ships quietly sailed through the narrow entrance and secured themselves side by side against the rocky shore. Odysseus, however, hesitated. Throughout his long journey, experience had taught him never to trust appearances completely. Rather than entering the enclosed harbor, he chose to anchor his own ship outside the entrance, fastening it securely to rocks overlooking the bay. Homer never fully explains why Odysseus made this decision. Perhaps instinct warned him. Perhaps years of hardship had simply made him more cautious than the others. Whatever his reasoning, this single choice would soon determine who lived and who died. Curious to learn who ruled this unfamiliar land, Odysseus selected 3 trusted companions and sent them inland to explore. Carrying no drawn weapons and following the sacred Greek custom of peaceful first contact, the men walked carefully along a winding path leading away from the harbor. The landscape around them appeared strangely beautiful. Towering cliffs surrounded deep valleys where fresh streams flowed quietly between smooth stones. There were no farms, no grazing animals, no fishermen repairing nets beside the shore. The silence itself became unsettling. Eventually the scouts reached a broad road where they encountered a young girl carrying a large water jar from a spring. According to Homer, she was the daughter of King Antiphates, ruler of the land. Politely, the Greeks asked where they might find the king's palace, expecting perhaps the warm hospitality they had once received from Aeolus or other civilized rulers. Without speaking many words, the girl simply pointed toward an enormous building standing upon higher ground. Thanking her, the sailors climbed the remaining distance until they entered the royal hall. What they discovered there shattered every expectation. Waiting inside was not an ordinary queen or noble woman, but a gigantic woman whose size dwarfed even the tallest human being. Before the terrified Greeks could react, she called loudly for her husband. Moments later, King Antiphates himself appeared, and unlike Polyphemus, he was not alone. He belonged to an entire race of giants known as the Laestrygonians. Without hesitation or conversation, the king seized one of the Greek sailors as easily as an ordinary man might pick up a child. Homer offers almost no dramatic description because the horror speaks for itself. The unfortunate scout was instantly killed and carried away as food, while his 2 surviving companions fled in absolute terror, racing back toward the harbor as fast as their legs could carry them. Behind them echoed the thunderous footsteps of creatures unlike anything they had ever imagined. The nightmare of the Cyclops had returned, but this time there was not just one giant waiting in a lonely cave. An entire kingdom had awakened, and before the sun set over those silent cliffs, Odysseus would witness the destruction of nearly everything he still possessed. The destruction of the Laestrygonians marked a turning point unlike any Odysseus had experienced before, when the echoes of the giants' thunderous footsteps finally disappeared behind the distant cliffs, and the enormous stones they had hurled no longer splashed into the sea. An unbearable silence settled over the lonely ship that remained. Only one vessel had escaped the harbor. 11 others, each carrying loyal companions who had survived the 10 long years of the Trojan. War now rested forever beneath the dark waters of the Mediterranean. The sea that had so often carried hope now concealed the graves of hundreds of Greek sailors whose names history would never remember. Standing quietly at the stern, Odysseus watched the empty horizon where his fleet had once stretched proudly across the water. Now there was only a single black-holed ship drifting through the endless blue. Homer never describes Odysseus collapsing beneath grief or shouting toward the heavens in despair. Instead, he presents a far more human image. A leader forced to remain strong while carrying a sorrow too heavy for words. Every empty rowing bench reminded him of a friend who would never again see Ithaca. Every unused or recalled hands that had rowed beside him through storms, battles, and impossible adventures. Leadership, he now understood, often meant surviving long enough to mourn everyone else. Ancient Greek audiences deeply appreciated this quiet form of heroism. While many myths celebrated warriors through glorious victories, the Odyssey repeatedly reminds its listeners that true courage often consists of continuing the journey after losing almost everything. Odysseus had not failed because he lacked intelligence or bravery. He had simply become another mortal struggling against a world where even the wisest men could not control fate. As the only surviving ship slowly sailed away from the land of the Laestrygonians, the ocean once again became vast and empty, as though the sea itself had quietly erased every trace of the terrible massacre that had taken place only hours before. Several days passed with little conversation among the survivors. The cheerful songs that sailors once sang to keep rhythm while rowing had disappeared entirely. Even the wind seemed softer, carrying only the gentle creaking of the wooden mast and the quiet splash of oars dipping into calm water. During those long hours, Odysseus spent much of his time gazing toward the horizon, carefully studying every cloud, every distant coastline, and every change in the weather. His years of wandering had transformed him into far more than a king or warrior. He had become an experienced navigator, capable of reading the sea, almost as though it were a living creature. Ancient Greek sailors possessed no compass, no accurate maps, and certainly no satellites guiding them across the Mediterranean. Instead, they depended upon the position of the sun during daylight, familiar constellations after sunset, seasonal winds, the movement of birds, and generations of practical knowledge passed from one sailor to another. Every voyage demanded extraordinary skill. A single mistake in navigation could carry a ship hundreds of miles from its intended destination, especially when powerful currents or unexpected storms intervened. Homer subtly reflects this reality throughout the Odyssey, reminding his audience that the sea was never simply a road connecting one island to another. It was an unpredictable wilderness where every successful arrival felt almost miraculous. Eventually, as another quiet morning dawned, a new island slowly emerged from the mist ahead. Unlike the harsh cliffs of the Lastrygonians or the lonely cave of the Cyclops, this land appeared remarkably beautiful. Dense forests covered gentle hillsides, while tall cedar and oak trees swayed peacefully beneath the warm Mediterranean breeze. Clear streams sparkled beneath the sunlight, and delicate columns of smoke drifted lazily upward through the trees, suggesting that someone or something lived somewhere deep within the island's interior. To the exhausted Greeks, the place seemed almost welcoming. After weeks of fear and constant loss, many desperately wished to believe they had finally discovered a peaceful refuge where they might rest and recover. Yet experience had already taught Odysseus one painful lesson. The most beautiful places often concealed the greatest dangers. Choosing caution over haste, Odysseus climbed a nearby hill to observe the unfamiliar land before allowing his companions to explore it. From that high vantage point, he carefully studied the forests stretching toward the island's center until his attention settled upon the thin trail of smoke rising steadily above the trees. Someone was clearly preparing food or maintaining a fire. That simple discovery brought mixed emotions. Human settlement could mean hospitality, fresh supplies, and valuable information about the surrounding seas. It could just as easily mean another unknown danger. Homer frequently emphasizes this uncertainty because it reflected the reality of ancient travel. Every stranger represented both hope and risk. There were no governments protecting foreign visitors, no common laws extending across distant kingdoms, and no guarantee that unfamiliar people would respect the sacred customs of hospitality. Deciding that information remained more valuable than assumptions, Odysseus divided his surviving crew into two equal groups by drawing lots, a practice commonly used throughout ancient Greece whenever impartial decisions became necessary. Fate assigned one group to explore the mysterious island, while Odysseus remained behind with the others near the shoreline, ready to respond if trouble arose. Led by the experienced warrior Eurylochus, the exploring party carefully entered the cool shade of the forest, following narrow paths winding between towering trees, alive with birdsong and gentle rustling leaves. As they ventured deeper inland, they noticed something unusual. Wolves and lions wandered freely through the woods, yet instead of attacking, the animals calmly approached the strangers, wagging their tails almost like loyal household dogs greeting familiar guests. To modern readers, this scene may appear strangely magical, but to Homer's audience it immediately signaled that powerful supernatural forces were at work. Wild predators simply did not behave this way. The peaceful animals served as the first silent warning that ordinary natural laws no longer governed this mysterious island. Hidden somewhere beyond the trees waited someone capable of bending nature itself to her will. Her name was Circe, daughter of the sun god Helios, one of the most powerful enchantresses in all of Greek mythology. And before this day came to an end, Odysseus would discover that strength, intelligence, and courage alone offered little protection against true magic. The greatest test of his journey was only beginning. The deeper Eurylochus and his companions ventured into the forest, the stranger the island seemed to become. Sunlight filtered gently through towering cedar and oak trees, painting shifting patterns across the soft earth beneath their feet. Birds sang peacefully somewhere high above the branches, while a warm breeze carried the sweet fragrance of wild herbs and flowering shrubs that grew freely across the island. Everything felt almost impossibly beautiful, as though nature itself had been carefully arranged to welcome every traveler who arrived upon these shores. Yet beneath that peaceful beauty lingered an unsettling silence that none of the sailors could fully explain. Even the wolves and lions they had encountered moments earlier remained strangely calm, quietly following the Greeks through the forest without showing the slightest sign of aggression. Every instinct told the sailors that something about this place defied the ordinary rules of the world they knew. In the Mediterranean lands of Bronze Age Greece, wild predators inspired fear and respect. No experienced traveler would expect to walk safely among lions without drawing a weapon or preparing for attack. Yet here the great beasts brushed gently against their legs, almost like household dogs greeting familiar guests. Homer deliberately creates this dreamlike atmosphere to prepare his audience for a different kind of danger. Unlike the Cyclops or the Lastrygonians, whose threats came through overwhelming physical strength, the island of Aeaea introduced something far more mysterious. Here, danger wore the comforting appearance of peace. Ancient Greek mythology often warned that the greatest temptations rarely announced themselves openly. They arrived quietly, hidden beneath beauty, hospitality, and promises of comfort. To Homer's original listeners, the strangely gentle animals would have immediately revealed that powerful magic governed this island long before the enchantress herself ever appeared. Eventually the trees opened into a wide clearing where an extraordinary palace stood, surrounded by flowering gardens and carefully tended orchards. Smooth stone walls reflected the afternoon sunlight, while graceful columns supported an elegant roof unlike anything the weary sailors had expected to discover in such a remote place. Smoke rose peacefully from the chimney, carrying the comforting smell of freshly baked bread and roasting meat into the warm air. Through the open doorway drifted the soft sound of a woman's voice singing quietly to herself while weaving upon a magnificent loom. The melody echoed gently through the forest with such remarkable beauty that the exhausted Greeks found themselves stopping simply to listen. Music occupied an important place within ancient Greek life. Songs accompanied religious festivals, weddings, funerals, and long evenings beside the hearth. Skilled singers were greatly admired because they preserved history, myths, and heroic deeds through oral tradition centuries before those stories were ever written down. Homer himself, whether a single historical poet or the symbolic name for generations of storytellers, almost certainly belonged to this musical tradition. The enchanting voice, now floating from the palace, represented everything civilized, cultured, and welcoming. There was no sign of violence. No visible guards stood outside the entrance. No hostile warriors prepared an ambush. Instead, the palace appeared to embody the sacred Greek ideal of hospitality that Odysseus had encountered many times before. Believing fortune had finally smiled upon them after so much suffering, Eurylochus and most of his companions cautiously approached the doorway. Only Eurylochus himself hesitated. Homer offers no detailed explanation for his reluctance. Perhaps instinct warned him, just as Odysseus had once hesitated before entering the harbor of the Lastrygonians. Perhaps the strange behavior of the animals had awakened suspicions that refused to disappear. Whatever the reason, he quietly remained outside while the others accepted the invitation of the beautiful woman who now appeared smiling warmly at the entrance of her home. Circe welcomed the strangers with flawless kindness. She invited them inside, offered comfortable seats around polished wooden tables, and served generous portions of bread, cheese, roasted meat, and fragrant wine mixed with herbs gathered from the island's forests. To starving sailors who had endured endless storms, battles, and months of uncertainty, the meal appeared nothing short of miraculous. Ancient Greek hospitality required hosts to feed and care for travelers, before asking questions about their identity, and Circe followed every outward appearance of that sacred tradition perfectly. Yet hidden within the wine, she quietly mixed powerful enchantments known only to the children of the gods. In Greek mythology, Circe was celebrated not merely as a witch in the modern sense, but as a master of pharmaca, fascinating combination of herbs, medicines, poisons, and magical potions believed capable of altering both body and mind. The ancient Greeks possessed surprisingly advanced knowledge of plants and their medicinal properties. Physicians, herbalists, and priests all understood that certain roots and flowers could heal wounds, ease pain, or induce deep sleep. Homer transforms this practical knowledge into mythology by imagining a woman whose understanding of nature had become almost limitless. As the unsuspecting sailors finished their meal, Circe quietly lifted a slender wand and touched each man one after another. Instantly the spell took hold. Their bodies began changing in horrifying ways. Hands became hooves, faces stretched into snouts. Human voices dissolved into frightened squeals. Thick bristles covered their skin as the sailors were transformed into pigs before their own terrified eyes. Yet Homer adds one haunting detail that makes the scene especially tragic. Although their bodies had become those of animals, their human minds remained completely unchanged. They still remembered their homes, their families, the fall of Troy, and every hardship endured beside Odysseus. Fully aware of what had happened, they could do nothing except cry out in helpless terror, while Circe calmly herded them into sturdy pens beside her palace. Scattering acorns before them as though feeding ordinary livestock, it is one of the Odyssey's most unforgettable images, because it explores a timeless fear shared by people across every culture, the terror of losing one's humanity while remaining painfully conscious of it. Outside the palace, Eurylochus watched the impossible transformation unfold through the open doorway. Frozen with horror, he realized that no sword or spear could defeat such supernatural power. Turning immediately, he fled back through the forest toward the shoreline, where Odysseus still waited anxiously beside the only remaining ship. Every step carried terrible news. Once again, another unknown island had stolen his companions. But unlike every challenge before, this enemy possessed a power that no ordinary warrior had ever been trained to fight. Eurylochus reached the shoreline almost without realizing how far he had run. Branches had torn his cloak, his breathing came in desperate gasps, and every step across the rocky ground felt heavier than the last. The remaining sailors immediately rushed toward him, their faces filled with fear long before he managed to speak a single word. One look at his expression told them that something had gone terribly wrong. Odysseus himself stood first among them, placing a steady hand upon his companion's shoulder, while waiting patiently for him to regain enough breath to explain what had happened. Ancient Greek storytellers often understood that silence could be far more powerful than loud emotion. For several long moments, Eurylochus simply stared toward the forest as though struggling to believe his own memories. Finally, in a trembling voice, he described everything he had witnessed. He spoke of the magnificent palace hidden among the trees, of the beautiful woman whose gentle singing welcomed weary strangers, of the generous meal prepared with every appearance of sacred hospitality, and finally of the impossible transformation that had followed. One moment his companions had been ordinary men, the next they had become helpless animals, imprisoned behind wooden fences, while somehow remaining painfully aware of their own humanity. Around the shoreline, complete silence. Followed his account. Even those who had survived Troy, the Cyclops, and the Lastrygonians found the story almost impossible to accept. They had fought monsters before. They had escaped giants and storms. But this was something entirely different. Against swords and spears, courage might still matter. Against magic itself, no soldier knew how to fight. Without the slightest hesitation, Odysseus reached for his bronze sword and long spear. Before anyone could stop him, he announced that he would go alone into the forest to rescue his companions. Eurylochus immediately stepped forward, desperately trying to change his king's mind. His voice carried neither cowardice nor selfishness, but the honest fear of a man who had witnessed a power beyond human understanding. He begged Odysseus not to throw away the last remaining hope of everyone still alive, if their king also disappeared. The final ship would drift endlessly across the sea without purpose or leadership. Yet Odysseus refused to listen. Throughout the Odyssey, Homer repeatedly shows that one quality separates Odysseus from nearly every other hero of his age. He never abandoned those who depended upon him. Again and again, he willingly placed himself in danger, if even the smallest chance remained that others might be saved. It is easy to admire courage during victory. Far more difficult is choosing courage when every logical argument suggests certain defeat. As Odysseus quietly disappeared beneath the shadows of the forest, carrying only his weapons and determination, he almost certainly understood that he might never return. The path before him led not toward an enemy he could defeat with strength, but toward a mystery no ordinary mortal fully understood. Yet perhaps that uncertainty itself made the journey necessary. Great leaders, Homer reminds us, often continue walking long after fear has become unavoidable. The forest welcomed Odysseus with the same strange beauty that had greeted Eurylochus earlier that day. Sunlight drifted softly between towering trees, while birds continued singing peacefully among the branches overhead. The tame wolves and lions wandered silently through the undergrowth, watching the lone traveler with calm, intelligent eyes that seemed almost human. Nothing about the island suggested violence, and yet every peaceful detail only deepened the growing sense that ordinary natural laws had somehow been suspended. Then, as Odysseus followed the narrow woodland path toward Circe's palace, something extraordinary happened. Standing suddenly before him appeared a handsome young traveler, unlike anyone he had ever seen. His face shone with unusual brightness, his posture carried effortless confidence, and in one hand he held a slender golden staff that seemed almost to glow beneath the afternoon sunlight. Although he appeared youthful, there was an unmistakable sense of timeless wisdom surrounding him. Homer immediately reveals what Odysseus himself soon understands. This was no ordinary man wandering alone through the wilderness. It was Hermes, the swift-footed messenger of the gods. In Greek mythology, Hermes occupied one of the most fascinating roles among the Olympians. He served as the divine messenger carrying the commands of Zeus across heaven and earth. He guided travelers upon dangerous roads, protected merchants and shepherds, escorted the souls of the dead toward the underworld, and above all represented intelligence, adaptability, and quick thinking. Unlike Ares, who glorified open warfare, Hermes solved problems through wit and knowledge. In many ways he resembled Odysseus himself, which perhaps explains why the god chose to intervene personally. Ancient Greek audiences would have recognized this meeting as profoundly significant. The Olympians rarely offered direct assistance without purpose. When a god appeared before a mortal, history itself was about to change. Hermes smiled warmly before speaking, as though greeting an old friend whose arrival he had expected all along. He warned Odysseus that entering Circe's palace without preparation would end exactly as it had for the others. No human strength, no sharpened spear, and no carefully crafted shield could resist the enchantress's magic. But the messenger of Zeus had not come merely to deliver bad news. Reaching into the grass beside the woodland path, Hermes carefully pulled from the earth a small plant unlike any ordinary herb growing upon the island. Its root was dark as freshly turned soil, while its delicate white flower seemed almost to shine beneath the filtered sunlight. Holding it toward Odysseus, the god explained that this rare plant was known among immortals as moly. According to Homer, no ordinary human possessed the strength to dig it from the earth, yet the gods found the task effortless. Modern scholars have spent centuries debating whether Homer based moly upon a real Mediterranean plant believed to possess medicinal properties, or whether it existed purely within mythology. Some have suggested snowdrops, wild garlic, or other herbs known since antiquity. Others believe the flower symbolizes divine wisdom itself, the idea that knowledge granted by higher powers can overcome dangers impossible to defeat through force alone. Whatever its true inspiration, Hermes instructed Odysseus to carry the plant with him and consume it before entering Circe's hall. When the enchantress offered her enchanted drink, the magic would fail. Then, the moment she realized her spell had no effect, Odysseus must draw his sword and advance boldly toward her, not to kill her, but to force her into an oath sworn before the immortal gods that she would never again seek to harm him or his companions. Having delivered every instruction, Hermes offered one final encouraging smile. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the messenger of Olympus vanished among the quiet trees, leaving Odysseus standing alone once more. In one hand he carried his bronze sword. In the other rested the mysterious white flower known only to the gods. Ahead, hidden beyond the forest, Circe continued singing softly within her magnificent palace, completely unaware that for the first time in countless years a visitor approached whom her magic could not control. Holding the mysterious white flower tightly within his hand, Odysseus slowly continued along the narrow forest path exactly as Hermes had instructed. Around him the island remained as peaceful as ever. Warm afternoon sunlight filtered gently through the tall cedar trees, while birds continued singing from hidden branches high above the woodland floor. The tame lions and wolves wandered silently nearby, occasionally lifting their heads to observe the lonely traveler before returning to their quiet rest beneath the shade. Everything about the island seemed calm enough to lull even the most cautious visitor into lowering his guard. Yet Odysseus now understood that this peaceful beauty concealed extraordinary danger. Every step brought him closer to a woman capable of changing human beings into animals with nothing more than a simple meal and the touch of a slender wand. Few heroes throughout Greek mythology willingly walked toward such a confrontation. Most would have searched for another path, gathered a larger army, or abandoned hope entirely. But Odysseus had already learned during the long years following Troy that some battles could not be avoided. Leadership demanded difficult choices, especially when the lives of loyal companions depended entirely upon one man's willingness to face the unknown. Ancient Greek audiences deeply admired this quiet determination. Homer rarely presents courage as loud or dramatic. Instead, true bravery often appears in the simple act of continuing forward despite overwhelming uncertainty. Odysseus possessed no guarantee that Hermes' advice would succeed. He had only faith in the wisdom offered by a god and confidence in his own ability to remain calm beneath impossible pressure. Those two qualities, divine guidance and human intelligence, would soon determine whether another tragedy awaited the Greeks or whether hope still survived somewhere upon the enchanted island of Aeaea. At last the magnificent palace came into view once again. Smoke drifted peacefully from the chimney, carrying the comforting aroma of warm bread and roasting meat into the gentle afternoon air. Inside, Circe continued singing softly while working at her great loom, her voice floating through the open doorway with remarkable beauty. Nothing about the scene suggested cruelty or violence. If Odysseus had arrived without knowing what had happened to his companions, he might easily have mistaken the palace for one of the safest places he had visited since leaving Greece. As soon as Circe noticed the stranger standing outside, she welcomed him with the same warm smile she had offered the others only hours before. Gracefully inviting him inside, she prepared another generous feast exactly as Greek custom required. Fresh bread, fragrant wine, roasted meat, and carefully prepared herbs filled the polished wooden table. Yet, hidden within the wine, just as before, she quietly mixed the powerful enchantment that had already transformed so many sailors into helpless animals. Odysseus accepted the meal without revealing the slightest suspicion. Before raising the cup to his lips, however, he secretly consumed the sacred herb Hermes had given him. Homer tells us that the effect was immediate, though invisible. When Circe finally lifted her golden wand and spoke the familiar words of enchantment, nothing happened. The spell that had never failed her before simply vanished like smoke carried away by the wind. Odysseus remained exactly as he was attired, but determined king, standing calmly before the astonished enchantress. For the first time in countless years, Circe stared at a mortal whose humanity her magic could not touch. Before she could recover from her surprise, Odysseus drew his shining bronze sword and advanced exactly as Hermes had instructed. Yet Homer carefully notes that he did not attack recklessly. Instead, he stood before her with controlled confidence, forcing the enchantress to recognize that the balance of power had suddenly changed. Circe herself stepped backward in genuine fear. She had spent years commanding absolute control over every visitor who reached her island, but now she faced someone protected by forces even her ancient magic could not overcome. Realizing that resistance had become impossible, Circe lowered her wand and spoke words that completely transformed the encounter. Rather than continuing the struggle, she looked carefully into Odysseus' face, before asking a remarkable question. "Who are you?" she whispered. "What mortal possesses such strength that my enchantments cannot touch him?" Almost immediately she reached an astonishing conclusion. Surely, she declared, this could only be the famous Odysseus, whose arrival had been foretold long ago. Ancient prophecy occupied an important place within Greek mythology. Gods, seers, and oracles frequently knew fragments of future events, though rarely in complete detail. Circe explained that Hermes himself had once hinted a remarkable traveler would eventually arrive, one whose intelligence surpassed that of ordinary men and whose destiny stretched far beyond her island. At that moment, fear gave way to admiration. Placing her wand aside, Circe swore a solemn oath by the immortal gods that she would never again seek to harm Odysseus or any member of his crew. Oaths carried extraordinary importance in the ancient world. To swear falsely before the Olympian gods invited terrible divine punishment, making such promises among the strongest guarantees imaginable. Satisfied that her pledge was sincere, Odysseus lowered his sword. Yet before accepting peace, he demanded one thing above all else. His companions must immediately be restored to human form. Without hesitation, Circe led him toward the animal pens where the unfortunate sailors still wandered in despair. Lifting another vessel filled with different herbs and clear spring water, she gently touched each enchanted prisoner once more. Slowly, almost miraculously, coarse bristles disappeared. Hooves softened into human hands. Snouts shortened into familiar faces. Voices that had been trapped inside helpless bodies finally returned as grateful men embraced one another with tears in their eyes. Homer even tells us that after the spell was broken, the sailors appeared stronger, younger, and more handsome than before, as though Circe's restorative magic had erased not only the enchantment, but much of the exhaustion accumulated during years of wandering. The palace that had moments earlier seemed a place of terror suddenly became a sanctuary of healing. Once again the Greeks gathered around a welcoming table, but this time without fear. Their greatest enemy had become their unexpected ally. Yet Odysseus still had no idea that the months ahead would quietly slip away beneath Circe's generous hospitality. Delaying his long journey home even further, while fate patiently prepared the next and perhaps strangest chapter of the Odyssey, the descent into the world of the dead. When the first excitement of reunion finally faded, an unfamiliar feeling slowly returned to the hearts of Odysseus and his companions. For the first time since leaving Troy, they no longer lived beneath constant fear. No giants waited beyond the next hill. No storms threatened to tear apart their fragile ship. No desperate struggle for survival greeted each new sunrise. Instead, life settled into an almost unbelievable rhythm of peace. Circe, who only hours earlier had seemed one of the most dangerous beings in the entire world, now welcomed the exhausted Greeks as honored guests beneath her roof. Every morning the palace echoed with quiet conversation instead of cries for help. Fresh bread baked within warm stone ovens, fragrant herbs filled the kitchens with comforting aromas, and servants prepared generous meals unlike anything the sailors had tasted since the early days of the Trojan War. Soft music drifted through the grand halls, while sunlight poured gently through open windows overlooking flowering gardens and ancient olive trees. Even the forests surrounding the palace seemed transformed. The lions and wolves that had once appeared unsettling now wandered peacefully among the gardens like loyal companions. their calm presence serving as a constant reminder that this island belonged to a world where ordinary rules no longer applied. Homer deliberately slows the pace of the Odyssey during these chapters, almost inviting his audience to rest alongside the weary travelers after years of bloodshed, storms, monsters, and endless uncertainty. Both the heroes and those listening to their story are offered a rare opportunity to breathe. Yet beneath this peaceful surface lies one of the Odyssey's quietest warnings. Comfort itself can become another kind of temptation. Human beings who have suffered greatly often discover that leaving safety behind becomes far more difficult than enduring hardship. Ancient Greek audiences understood this lesson well. The greatest obstacles are not always terrifying monsters. Sometimes they appear as comfortable homes, warm meals, soft beds, and the gentle invitation to forget every responsibility waiting beyond the horizon. Days slowly became weeks, and before anyone truly noticed, the changing seasons quietly marked the passing of nearly an entire year. The survivors who had once arrived on Aeaea thin, exhausted and broken by grief gradually regained their strength beneath Circe's generous care. Old wounds healed, weather-beaten skin recovered beneath the Mediterranean sun. Muscles weakened by months of rowing and battle grew strong once again through peaceful labor around the palace. Some sailors helped maintain the gardens. Others repaired clothing, polished bronze weapons, strengthened the ship's aging timbers, or simply rested beneath the shade of ancient trees while sharing stories of home. For many, it became the closest thing to ordinary life they had experienced in over a decade. Homer subtly reminds his audience that these men were not machines built only for adventure. They were ordinary human beings who longed for stability after years of unimaginable hardship. Modern psychology might describe their behavior as the natural response of people recovering from prolonged trauma. The Greeks themselves expressed the same. Truth through mythology, even heroes needed moments of healing before continuing their journeys. During this peaceful year, Odysseus himself spent many hours speaking with Circe. Unlike many later retellings that focus almost entirely upon romance, Homer presents their relationship with greater complexity. Circe was no longer merely an enchantress or adversary. She possessed extraordinary knowledge inherited from her father Helios, the immortal sun god whose chariot crossed the heavens each day. She understood distant lands, ancient prophecies, forgotten kingdoms, the hidden nature of the gods, and mysteries no ordinary mortal could hope to learn. Odysseus, whose greatest strength had always been curiosity, listened carefully to every story. The palace became not only a place of physical recovery, but also a place of learning. Throughout the Odyssey, knowledge repeatedly proves just as valuable as swords or shields. Intelligence, patience, and the willingness to seek wisdom continue protecting Odysseus far more often than brute strength ever could. Yet, while peace slowly healed weary bodies, it could not erase memory forever. One quiet evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the western sea, and the palace glowed softly beneath hundreds of oil lamps, several of Odysseus' oldest companions approached their king with unusual hesitation. They spoke respectfully, almost apologetically, reminding him of something no one wished to discuss. Ithaca still waited. Somewhere across the endless Mediterranean, wives continued, hoping for husbands who had vanished 20 long years earlier. Children had grown into adults without fathers, Elderly parents may have already died, believing their sons would never return. Even Penelope, whose faithfulness had become legendary, could not wait forever. Homer presents this conversation with remarkable tenderness because it reflects one of the most universal experiences in human life. Happiness found along the journey can never completely replace the place we truly call home. Listening quietly beneath the fading evening light, Odysseus realized his companions spoke the truth. The comfort of Aeaea had slowly become another delay upon a voyage already lasting far too long. The next morning he approached Circe and gently explained that the time had finally come to continue the journey toward Ithaca. Rather than becoming angry or trying to persuade him to remain, the enchantress surprised everyone with calm understanding. She admitted that fate had never intended him to stay forever. But before any ship could safely sail home, one final task remained, perhaps the strangest and most frightening challenge of the entire Odyssey. Looking steadily into Odysseus' eyes, Circe explained that no ordinary path could now lead him safely back to Greece. First, he must travel. Somewhere no living sailor willingly entered. He must sail beyond the familiar world, beyond the lands of ordinary men, to the dark kingdom of Hades, where the spirits of the dead wandered endlessly beneath the earth. There, among countless forgotten souls, he must seek the blind prophet Tiresias, whose wisdom alone could reveal the road home. The peaceful year on Aeaea had come to an end. Ahead waited a destination unlike any visited before on an island of monsters or kings, but the silent realm where every mortal life eventually arrived. And for the first time in Greek mythology, a living hero would willingly descend into the land of the dead while still drawing breath. That evening, after Circe revealed what fate demanded next, an unusual silence settled over the palace. The cheerful conversations that had filled its halls throughout the past year slowly disappeared, replaced by thoughtful whispers and long moments of quiet reflection. Even the servants moved more softly than before, as though the very walls had sensed the weight of the journey that now awaited the Greeks. Beyond the open windows, the last golden light of the Mediterranean sunset faded behind distant hills, leaving the gardens wrapped in gentle shades of blue and silver beneath the rising moon. Somewhere among the olive trees, the tame wolves lay peacefully beneath ancient branches, while the lions rested motionless beside the stone pathways, their calm eyes reflecting the pale light of the stars. Everything upon Aeaea remained beautiful, yet for Odysseus that beauty had begun to carry the bittersweet feeling of farewell. He understood that by the following sunrise this peaceful island would become another memory added to an already endless collection of places forever left behind. Throughout the Odyssey, Homer repeatedly reminds his audience that every safe harbor is only temporary. No matter how welcoming the people, no matter how comforting the home, destiny continues moving quietly forward, asking every traveler to rise once more and continue the road ahead. It is perhaps one of the poem's deepest reflections on human life itself. We often wish certain peaceful moments could last forever, yet time refuses to stand still. Childhood fades into adulthood. Seasons quietly replace one another. Loved ones grow older. Even happiness asks us eventually to let go and continue walking. Homer expresses these universal truths not through philosophical speeches, but through simple images of ships leaving familiar shores behind. Later that night, Circe invited Odysseus to sit with her beside a small fire burning within the palace courtyard. Above them stretched a sky unlike anything seen in modern cities, without artificial light to dim their brilliance. Thousands upon thousands of stars covered the heavens from horizon to horizon, forming the same constellations that Bronze Age sailors had followed for countless generations. Long before the invention of the compass, Greek navigators depended almost entirely upon the stars, the direction of the wind, the color of the sea, and the seasonal movements of birds to guide their voyages across the Mediterranean. Odysseus himself had spent decades reading the night sky, recognizing Orion, the Pleiades, the Great Bear, and countless other familiar patterns that served as silent companions during lonely nights upon the open sea. Yet Circe now spoke of a destination lying beyond every ordinary map. Calmly she explained that the voyage ahead would carry them toward the very edge of the known world, where Oceanus, the vast river believed by ancient Greeks to encircle the earth, flowed endlessly around the lands of mortals. Beyond those mysterious waters stretched a realm untouched by sunlight, where no ordinary kingdom existed, and no living nation built cities or cultivated fields. It was there, she said, that the entrance to the kingdom of Hades could be found. Modern readers often imagine the underworld as a fiery place of punishment, influenced by much later religious traditions. The ancient Greeks imagined something remarkably different. Hades was neither heaven nor hell in the modern sense. Instead, it was the inevitable destination awaiting every human soul, regardless of wealth, fame, or courage. Kings, farmers, poets, soldiers, mothers, children all eventually crossed into the same silent realm. Only a handful of legendary figures ever entered while still alive, and even fewer returned. By sending Odysseus there, Homer elevates his hero beyond ordinary warriors. This journey would not merely test physical courage, it would require him to confront mortality itself, to stand face to face with the truth that no living person could escape forever. Before the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Circe carefully prepared everything the voyage would require. She ordered her servants to gather generous stores of bread, dried meat, cheese, olives, fresh water, fragrant wine, and finely woven cloaks for the sailors. Strong ropes replaced those weakened by years of storms, while skilled craftsmen inspected every timber of the remaining ship to ensure it could survive yet another impossible journey. More importantly, Circe explained the sacred rituals that must be performed upon reaching the distant land where the living and the dead briefly touched. The prophet Tiresias, she warned, would not simply appear because someone called his name. Ancient Greek religion believed that communication with the dead demanded strict ceremonies governed by divine law. Odysseus must carry a black ram and a black Aeaea, animals traditionally associated with chthonic deities, the mysterious gods connected with the earth, death, and the hidden world beneath human feet. Upon reaching the appointed place, he would dig a narrow trench into the soil, and pour sacred offerings of milk mixed with honey, sweet wine, clear spring water, and barley flour before sacrificing the animals according to ancient custom. Only then, as the dark blood flowed into the earth, would the restless spirits gather from every corner of Hades, drawn irresistibly toward the offering. Yet Circe issued one final warning that chilled every sailor who heard it. No matter which familiar faces emerged from the darkness, Odysseus must allow no spirit to drink the sacrificial blood until Tiresias himself had spoken. The blood represented temporary strength and awareness for the dead, and if the countless wandering souls reached it first, confusion would overwhelm the entire ritual. Listening carefully beneath the fading stars, Odysseus committed every instruction to memory. Once again, success would depend not upon strength or bravery alone, but upon patience, discipline, and absolute obedience to ancient wisdom. As the first pale light of morning slowly spread across the sea, the Greeks quietly carried their supplies aboard the waiting ship. The sails were raised, the mooring ropes released, and with a gentle breeze filling the canvas, the last vessel of Odysseus slipped silently away from the enchanted shores of Aeaea. Behind them, Circe stood watching from the headland until both ship and sailors disappeared into the endless blue horizon. Ahead lay no ordinary island, no familiar coastline, but the shadowed frontier between life and death itself, where the greatest prophecy of the Odyssey waited in complete silence. With the first light of dawn glowing softly behind the eastern horizon, Odysseus' lonely ship slipped quietly away from the enchanted island of Aeaea. A gentle breeze, sent by Circe herself, according to Homer, filled the broad square sail and carried the vessel steadily across calm waters without the sailors needing to lift a single oar. It was an unusual gift, for throughout the Odyssey the sea had so often been an enemy, resisting every attempt to reach home. Now, almost as though fate wished to conserve the crew's strength for what lay ahead, the wind guided them silently westward across the endless Mediterranean. The men spoke very little. During previous voyages, the deck had often echoed with songs, stories, or hopeful conversations about Ithaca. This morning, however, every sailor seemed occupied by his own thoughts. Some sat quietly beside coils of rope, watching the gentle waves rise and fall against the wooden hull. Others gazed toward the shrinking outline of Circe's island until it disappeared entirely beneath the morning mist. No one knew exactly where they were sailing. They had crossed many seas before, yet every destination had existed somewhere within the living world. This time their course pointed toward a place that belonged not to ordinary geography, but to myth itself. Even among experienced Bronze Age sailors, stories of the Western Ocean inspired both fascination and fear. The farther ships traveled from familiar coastlines, the more uncertain the world became. Ancient Greeks possessed no detailed maps of distant oceans. Instead, imagination gradually filled the empty spaces beyond the known Mediterranean. Somewhere beyond the western horizon, many believed, lay Oceanus, the vast river encircling the earth like an endless ring. Beyond that flowed darkness untouched by the rising sun, where the ordinary laws governing human life slowly gave way to the mysterious realm of the gods. Homer uses this journey not simply to describe travel across physical distance, but to suggest movement between entirely different realities. With every mile the ship advanced, the crew left behind the comfortable certainty of the human world and approached a frontier where myth and existence merged into one. As the day passed, subtle changes began appearing around them. The familiar blue of the Mediterranean gradually deepened into darker shades that seemed almost impossible to describe. The cheerful cries of seabirds became fewer, until eventually the sky stood strangely silent. Dolphins, that had so often accompanied Greek ships, no longer appeared beneath the waves. Even the wind itself seemed quieter, blowing with remarkable steadiness, as though obeying some unseen command. Homer paints these details with extraordinary restraint. rather than frightening his audience through sudden monsters or violent storms. He allows the atmosphere itself to become increasingly unfamiliar. The sea remained calm, yet its silence felt different. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction without revealing another ship, another island, or even the faint outline of distant mountains. Modern readers sometimes forget how overwhelming such isolation would have felt to Bronze Age sailors navigating entirely by stars, sun, and memory. There were no lighthouses beyond the known coasts, no accurate charts waiting to reassure nervous captains, and certainly no certainty that help might arrive should disaster strike. Every voyage carried genuine risk. Homer transforms that historical reality into poetic symbolism. The farther Odysseus sails from civilization, the more completely he leaves behind the predictable order of everyday existence. Around him, the boundaries separating life from myth begin quietly dissolving. Ancient philosophers later reflected that every human being eventually undertakes a similar journey. We all travel from the familiar into the unknown, never fully certain what lies beyond the next horizon. The Odyssey expresses this universal truth through the simple image of one small ship crossing an immeasurable sea beneath an increasingly silent sky. By evening, the western heavens glowed briefly with deep shades of crimson before the light faded more quickly than anyone aboard expected. Night arrived with unusual swiftness, wrapping both sea and sky beneath a darkness thicker than any the sailors remembered. Normally the stars appeared almost immediately after sunset, guiding navigators safely across open water. Yet now even the familiar constellations seemed strangely distant, as though hidden behind an invisible veil. Orion, the Great Bear, and the bright Pleiades, faithful companions of countless previous voyages, shone only faintly above the horizon, before disappearing entirely into heavy darkness. The crew instinctively gathered closer together upon the deck. Without stars there could be no navigation, yet remarkably the wind never changed. It continued carrying the vessel onward with calm, unwavering purpose, suggesting that some divine power still directed their course. Greek mythology often portrayed darkness not merely as the absence of sunlight, but as a living force connected to the oldest powers of creation, before Zeus ruled Olympus, before even the Titans rose to power. Primordial beings such as Nyx, the goddess of night, and Erebus, the personification of deep darkness, already existed according to Hesiod's ancient poems. Homer subtly evokes those older myths without naming them directly. The sailors now entered a world where daylight itself seemed reluctant to follow. Somewhere ahead lay the Cimmerians, a mysterious people whom Homer describes as living forever beneath mist and shadow, never touched by the warm rays of Helios, the sun god. Historians have debated for centuries whether these people reflected vague memories of distant northern tribes, or whether Homer invented them entirely as symbolic guardians of the boundaries separating life from death. Whatever their historical origin, their land represented the final threshold before the kingdom of Hades itself. Odysseus and his companions, still fully alive, now approached a place no ordinary mortal willingly sought. The gentle rhythm of the waves continued beneath the hull, soft and almost hypnotic, carrying them steadily toward the greatest mystery any living Greek hero had ever dared to face. By the time another morning should have arrived, Odysseus and his companions noticed something deeply unsettling. Dawn never truly came. The darkness surrounding the ship did not lift into the familiar golden colors of sunrise. Instead, the world remained wrapped beneath a dim gray twilight that seemed to exist outside the ordinary rhythm of day and night. The sea itself had become strangely still. Gentle waves continued to rock the vessel, but their movement felt muted, as though even the water wished to remain silent in this forgotten corner of creation. No birds circled overhead. No fish leaped from the surface. The comforting sounds that had accompanied every previous voyage had vanished completely, leaving only the soft creaking of the wooden mast and the quiet whisper of the wind moving through the sail. Many of the sailors found themselves speaking only in hushed voices without fully understanding why. It was almost as though raising one's voice might disturb something ancient sleeping beyond the endless mist. Homer rarely describes fear through loud cries or dramatic speeches. Instead, he allows silence itself to become the source of unease. The absence of ordinary life often unsettles the human mind far more deeply than visible danger. Even today, travelers crossing isolated deserts, dense forests, or remote polar landscapes sometimes describe a similar feeling, the strange awareness that they have entered a place where nature seems indifferent to human existence. For Odysseus and his companions, however, this was something even greater. They had not merely sailed beyond familiar lands, they had crossed into a region that belonged almost entirely to myth, where the boundaries separating the living world from the unseen kingdom of the dead gradually disappeared beneath endless shadow. As the thick mist slowly drifted apart, dark land finally emerged ahead of the ship. Unlike every island the Greeks had previously visited, this coast showed almost no signs of ordinary life. There were no beaches glowing beneath warm sunlight, no fishing villages, no smoke rising from distant homes, and no shepherds leading flocks across gentle hillsides. Instead, steep cliffs of dark stone stretched along the shoreline beneath an unmoving blanket of cloud that hid the heavens above. Ancient trees grew silently across the landscape, their twisted branches reaching into the gray sky like countless motionless hands. Between them flowed slow black rivers whose surfaces reflected almost no light. Homer identifies this mysterious region as the land of the Cimmerians, a people who lived forever beneath darkness because the rays of Helios, the sun god, never reached their shores. Modern historians have long debated whether this description preserves distant memories of northern regions where long winters bring extended darkness, or whether Homer intended the Cimmerians to exist entirely within the symbolic geography of myth. Whatever their historical inspiration may have been, their role within the Odyssey is unmistakable. They stand upon the final frontier, separating the ordinary world from Hades itself. To the Greeks, geography often blended naturally with mythology. Certain mountains belonged to gods. Sacred caves served as entrances to hidden realms. Rivers became living divine beings rather than simple streams of water. In the same way, this shadowed coastline represented more than a physical destination. It marked the place where every mortal journey would one day end. Odysseus had reached the threshold that no sailor willingly sought, the silent edge of life itself. Following Circe's careful instructions, Odysseus guided the ship toward a narrow stretch of shore where the dark waters met the land. The sailors lowered the sail, secured the vessel with thick ropes, and quietly stepped onto the unfamiliar ground. None of them lingered to admire the landscape. Even the air felt unusually cold, despite the absence of any strong wind. Carrying the black ram and the black Aeaea that Circe had instructed them to bring, Odysseus walked inland until he found the lonely place she had described, a desolate clearing where two dark rivers appeared, to meet before disappearing once more into the endless mist. In Greek mythology, these rivers held profound significance. One was often associated with Acheron, the river of sorrow, while nearby flowed streams connected with Pyriphlegethon, the river of fire, and Cocytus, the river of lamentation. Later Greek writers would expand these descriptions into the famous 5 rivers of the underworld, each symbolizing a different aspect of death, memory, grief, or divine justice. Homer presents them more simply, yet their presence immediately signals that Odysseus has arrived at a place unlike any other in the living world. Without speaking unnecessarily, he knelt upon the cold earth and drew his bronze sword. Carefully he dug a shallow trench exactly as Circe had instructed. Into this sacred hollow he first poured sweet milk mixed with golden honey, symbols of nourishment and remembrance. Next came dark red wine, honoring the ancient traditions of sacrifice shared throughout the Greek world. Clear spring water followed, representing purity, while a handful of white barley flour was scattered gently across the damp soil. Every movement followed rituals preserved through countless generations, reminding both Homer's audience and modern listeners that religion in the ancient world was woven deeply into everyday life. These ceremonies were never empty gestures. The Greeks believed that precision mattered. A single mistake could offend the gods or render an offering powerless. Finally, standing silently beside the trench beneath the unchanging grey sky, Odysseus raised his eyes toward the invisible heavens and offered solemn prayers to the countless spirits dwelling below. The time for preparation had ended. Only one final act remained before the unseen inhabitants of Hades would begin rising from the darkness to answer his call. For several long moments nothing happened. Odysseus remained kneeling beside the shallow trench he had carefully carved into the dark earth, his bronze sword resting quietly in one hand while the final echoes of his prayers disappeared into the heavy silence surrounding him. Behind him, his companions stood close together without speaking, their eyes fixed upon the grey mist drifting slowly between the twisted trees. No breeze disturbed the branches overhead. No birds sang from hidden nests. Even the rivers flowing beside the clearing seemed almost unnaturally quiet, their black waters moving with slow determination toward destinations no living person could see. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the air began to change. A faint chill spread across the clearing, colder than any sea wind the Greeks had ever experienced. It was not the ordinary cold of winter or mountain snow. Instead, it carried a strange emptiness, as though warmth itself had quietly withdrawn from this forgotten place. The mist thickened, curling gently across the ground, until it surrounded the trench like pale smoke rising from unseen fires. Every sailor instinctively tightened his grip upon his spear, though each of them understood that no bronze weapon could protect a man from whatever now approached. Homer's description of this moment remains one of the most haunting passages in all of ancient literature, because nothing dramatic announces the arrival of the dead. There were no thunderclaps, no earthquakes, and no terrifying monsters bursting from the earth. Instead, death arrives with silence. the ordinary world simply begins to fade away, replaced by something older and infinitely quieter. Ancient Greek listeners would have recognized the profound symbolism within these details. Death was not imagined as endless violence, but as an absence of place where voices softened, colors faded, and movement slowed until time itself seemed almost forgotten. Odysseus remembered every word Circe had spoken. Whatever happened next, no spirit must be allowed to drink from the sacrificial blood before Tiresias arrived. His task sounded simple when spoken aloud. Standing alone before countless wandering souls, however, would require a courage unlike any he had needed against cyclopes or giants. Physical enemies could be defeated through cleverness or strength. The dead belonged to another order of existence entirely. They neither feared bronze nor obeyed the ordinary rules governing mortal life. Slowly, shapes began appearing within the mist. At first, they resembled nothing more than drifting shadows moving between the trees. Then, little by little, those shadows gathered into forms that almost resembled human beings. Faces emerged without color. Cloaks fluttered, although no wind blew. Direction, their movements slow and strangely weightless, as though each step barely touched the earth beneath them. The Greeks stared in speechless disbelief. Never before had they imagined what became of ordinary people after death. Now the answer stood before their own eyes. They were old men leaning upon invisible staffs, their shoulders forever bent beneath the burdens of long lives. Young warriors still appeared, as they had on the final day of battle, though every wound had faded into little more than pale memory. Mothers carried unseen children in their arms. Sailors, shepherds, kings, craftsmen, servants, and forgotten strangers all drifted together without distinction. In life, wealth and rank had separated them. Here, every soul possessed the same quiet appearance, reminding Homer's audience that death eventually reduced all human greatness to equal silence. This vision reflected one of the central beliefs of early Greek religion. Unlike later traditions promising eternal reward or punishment for most ordinary people, Homer's underworld was a place of shadows. The dead retained memories of their earthly lives, yet those memories carried neither the full joy nor the full pain they once possessed. Existence continued, but only faintly, like the final echo of a song after the musician had laid down his instrument. It was neither paradise nor endless torment. It was simply the unavoidable destination awaiting every mortal born beneath the sun. As more spirits gathered around the trench, an overwhelming sadness settled upon the clearing. Many of the shades stretched trembling hands toward the fresh blood pooling within the earth. They moved not with anger, but with desperate longing, drawn by an instinct stronger than memory itself. According to ancient Greek belief, the sacrificial blood briefly restored awareness to the dead, allowing them to think, remember, and speak as they had while alive. Without it, they wandered in an endless dreamlike existence, conscious yet incomplete. The temptation before them proved almost irresistible. One elderly spirit slowly reached forward, his transparent fingers trembling as though begging for a single drop. Another followed close behind, then another. Soon dozens of silent figures surrounded the trench, pressing closer with every passing heartbeat. Odysseus immediately rose to his feet. Drawing his shining bronze sword from its scabbard, he stepped directly between the restless spirits and the sacred offering. The gesture carried little physical meaning. No mortal blade could truly harm those who had already crossed beyond death. Yet Homer presents the sword as a symbol of authority, determination, and sacred duty. Odysseus stood not to fight the dead, but to guard the divine command entrusted to him. Again and again, shadowy hands reached toward the blood. Again and again, Odysseus held his ground. Minutes passed, perhaps longer. Within the strange stillness of that forgotten land, time itself seemed almost impossible to measure. Around him the gathering continued to grow. Hundreds of pale figures now filled the clearing, emerging silently from the endless darkness beyond the rivers. Some whispered names, long forgotten by the living. Others stared silently at the stranger who still possessed warm breath within his lungs. Many simply waited with infinite patience, their hollow eyes fixed upon the crimson offering lying only a few steps away. Among those countless faces, Odysseus began recognizing familiar features. Heroes whose names had echoed across the battlefields of Troy, old companions lost during the 10 long years of war, men who had once laughed beside evening campfires, soldiers buried beneath distant walls whose graves he had helped construct with his own hands. The sight pierced his heart more deeply than any spear ever could. These were no longer mighty warriors celebrated in song. They were only quiet shadows, patiently waiting in darkness. Yet, however strong the temptation became to speak with them, Odysseus never lowered his sword. Circe's warning remained clear within his mind. Only one spirit truly mattered. Only one possessed the knowledge capable of leading him safely home. And somewhere beyond the gathering multitude, hidden within the endless mist of Hades, the blind prophet Tiresias had already begun making his silent journey toward the world of the living. Among the countless shadows slowly gathering around the sacred trench, one figure eventually emerged with a presence unlike all the others. At first there seemed nothing extraordinary about him. Like every spirit surrounding the offering, he possessed the pale, weightless appearance of someone who had long ago left the world of sunlight behind. Yet, as he moved forward, the restless souls quietly drifted aside, without command, almost as though they instinctively recognized the importance of the one approaching. No voice ordered them to make way. No divine light surrounded his form. Nevertheless, an invisible dignity seemed to accompany every silent step. Odysseus immediately understood that this was no ordinary shade wandering through the kingdom of Hades. This was Tiresias, the legendary prophet whose wisdom had guided kings while he still lived among men. Throughout Greek mythology, Tiresias occupies a remarkable place, unlike almost any other mortal. Although blind for most of his life, he possessed a vision greater than those blessed with perfect sight. Ancient storytellers explained that the gods had taken away his physical eyesight, only to replace it with the far rarer gift of seeing hidden truths beyond the reach of ordinary human understanding. He advised rulers of Thebes, interpreted divine signs, understood the language of prophecy, and witnessed the rise and fall of generations long before the events of the Odyssey ever unfolded. Even death itself, Homer tells us, could not strip him of this extraordinary wisdom, while every other soul wandered Hades like a fading memory. Persephone, queen of the underworld, allowed Tiresias alone to preserve his complete awareness. It was for this reason, and this reason alone, that Circe had sent Odysseus across the boundary separating the living from the dead. Only one voice beneath the earth still possessed knowledge powerful, enough to illuminate the uncertain road home. Remaining faithful to the instructions he had received upon Aeaea, Odysseus continued holding the surrounding spirits at bay until Tiresias reached the edge of the trench. Only then did he slowly lower the tip of his bronze sword, allowing the ancient prophet to kneel beside the dark offering. The spirit bent forward and drank quietly from the sacrificial blood. Almost immediately, a remarkable transformation passed across his pale features. The empty distance within his expression disappeared, replaced by calm intelligence and perfect recognition. Slowly lifting his head, Tiresias looked directly toward Odysseus, not with physical eyes, for those had never seen the world, but with a deeper awareness untouched by death itself. His voice emerged soft and steady, carrying neither fear nor surprise, as though he had expected this meeting long before Odysseus himself had been born. "Son of Laertes," he began, "why have you abandoned the warmth of the sun to walk among those who have already completed life's journey?" The question carried no accusation. Instead, it reflected genuine understanding of the extraordinary sacrifice required for a living man to enter this forgotten kingdom. Odysseus respectfully explained everything that had happened since leaving Troy. The Cyclops, whose single eye he had blinded, the terrible anger of Poseidon, the destruction of nearly his entire fleet, the kindness of Circe, and finally his desperate hope of reaching Ithaca before fate claimed him forever. Throughout the conversation, Tiresias listened without interruption. Unlike many heroes within Greek mythology who rushed to display their own achievements, Odysseus possessed the quieter wisdom of knowing when to remain silent. Ancient Greek audiences admired this quality deeply. True intelligence, they believed, often revealed itself not through constant speaking, but through careful listening. Homer repeatedly presents Odysseus as a man whose greatest victories emerge from patience rather than pride. When Odysseus finished, a long silence settled once more across the clearing. Around them, countless waiting souls remained motionless, watching the conversation with quiet longing while the dark rivers flowed endlessly through the mist beyond. At last, Tiresias spoke again, and his words carried both hope and warning in equal measure. "You shall indeed return to Ithaca," the prophet declared, "but the road ahead remains filled with suffering." No prophecy in Greek mythology ever offered simple reassurance. The gods revealed possibilities, not guarantees, and every promise came entwined with responsibility. Tiresias explained that Poseidon had not forgotten the blinding of his son Polyphemus, although years had already passed since that encounter within the Cyclops cave. Divine anger moved according to its own measure of time. Mortal lives seemed brief to the Olympians, but resentment among the gods could endure across generations. The sea itself would continue opposing Odysseus for as long as the Earthshaker desired. Yet the prophet also revealed something entirely unexpected. The greatest danger still waiting upon the voyage home would not come from monsters, storms, or immortal enemies. Instead, it would arise from the choices made by Odysseus and his own companions. Ahead lay the sacred island of Thrinacia, where the magnificent cattle of Helios, the sun god, grazed beneath constant divine protection. Those sacred animals, Tiresias warned, must never be harmed under any circumstance. Hunger would tempt the sailors, desperation would cloud their judgment. Yet, if even a single cow was slaughtered, disaster would follow with absolute certainty. Zeus himself would ensure that every remaining companion perished upon the sea, leaving Odysseus to continue alone. The prophet's warning reflects one of the central themes running throughout the Odyssey. Again and again, disaster grows, not from unavoidable fate, but from human decisions. The gods may create difficult circumstances, yet individuals remain responsible for how they respond. Courage alone cannot save a man who abandons wisdom. Strength becomes meaningless when discipline disappears. Homer gently reminds his audience that many of life's greatest tragedies begin not with overwhelming enemies, but with one seemingly small decision made during moments of weakness. Listening beneath the eternal twilight of the underworld, Odysseus committed every word to memory. The prophecy had offered exactly what he had sought, not an easy road home, but a map showing where ruin waited for those unable to master themselves. Yet Tiresias had not yet finished speaking. His final prophecy would concern not only the journey back to Ithaca, but the strange destiny awaiting Odysseus long after every battle. Every storm and every adventure had finally come to an end. The clearing remained perfectly still as Tiresias finished speaking about the sacred cattle of Helios. Around him, countless silent spirits continued waiting patiently in the grey mist, their hollow eyes fixed upon the dark trench where the sacrificial blood still shimmered faintly beneath the eternal twilight. Odysseus listened without moving, careful not to interrupt even a single word. He understood that every sentence spoken by the blind prophet carried the weight of destiny itself. Unlike ordinary advice, prophecy within Greek mythology revealed possibilities hidden beyond the reach of human sight. Yet Homer always reminds his audience that prophecy does not remove free will. It shows the road ahead, but every traveler must still choose whether to follow it. That delicate balance between fate and personal choice lies at the very heart of the Odyssey. Again and again, the gods reveal warnings, offer guidance, or open opportunities, but human beings remain responsible for the decisions they make. Odysseus had already learned this lesson many times. His own pride before the Cyclops had awakened Poseidon's anger. His sailor's curiosity had opened Aeolus' bag of winds. Their fear had driven them toward countless unnecessary dangers. Now another choice waited somewhere in the future, one involving hunger, discipline, and respect for the immortal gods. Listening beneath the silent skies of the underworld, Odysseus realized that knowing the future did not necessarily make it easier to change. In many ways, it made the burden even heavier, because failure could no longer be blamed upon ignorance. After a long, thoughtful silence, Tiresias slowly lifted his head once more, and his voice became softer than before, almost as though he was speaking not only about the years ahead, but about the distant end of one remarkable human life. If, he said, you reach your beloved Ithaca and punish those who dishonor your home, your journey will still not be complete. These words surprised Odysseus more than anything he had heard so far. For nearly 20 years, every hardship, every battle, and every storm had been endured for one purpose, alone to return home. He had imagined that the moment his feet touched the shores of Ithaca, every sorrow would finally come to an end. Yet Tiresias gently revealed that even homecoming marked only another beginning after peace had been restored to his kingdom, after justice had been carried out against those who had abused his household. Odysseus would one day be required to undertake one final journey unlike any before it. Carrying a well-crafted oar across his shoulder, he must leave the sea behind and travel deep into lands where people had never looked upon the ocean. he would continue walking until he met someone who mistook the oar for an ordinary farming tool, a simple winnowing fan used to separate grain from chaff. Only there, in a place completely untouched by seafaring life, could he finally offer sacrifice to Poseidon and bring the sea god's ancient anger to its peaceful conclusion. Modern readers often overlook the extraordinary symbolism within this prophecy. Homer suggests that true reconciliation cannot be achieved merely by surviving conflict. It requires understanding, humility, and the willingness to leave behind the very identity that once defined us. Odysseus, the greatest sailor of his age, must eventually walk beyond the reach of the sea itself. The ocean that had shaped his entire existence would one day become something remembered rather than lived. It is one of the Odyssey's most beautiful reflections on growing older. Every human being eventually reaches a season when the struggles that once consumed life begin quietly fading into memory, making room for a different kind of wisdom. Then came the prophet's final words, perhaps the gentlest prophecy ever spoken within the poem. Tiresias told Odysseus that if he honored the gods and fulfilled every duty awaiting him, death itself would not arrive through violence or suffering. Instead, it would come peacefully out of the sea, when old age had already surrounded him with comfort. Loyal people and a kingdom living in harmony. Ancient Greek heroes rarely received such endings. Most legendary warriors met their fate upon battlefields, betrayed by rivals, or struck down during moments of great tragedy. Achilles died before Troy. Ajax fell by his own sword. Agamemnon was murdered within his own palace. Yet Odysseus, whose greatest weapon had always been wisdom rather than overwhelming strength, was promised something different. His reward would not be endless glory in war, but the quiet privilege of growing, old among those he loved. To Homer's original audience, this represented a blessing greater than almost any treasure. The Greeks deeply respected heroic courage, yet they also understood that endless violence could never become the highest purpose of life. The true victory lay in returning home, restoring peace, raising future generations, and allowing one's final years to unfold beneath familiar skies rather than foreign battlefields. As Tiresias finished speaking, a gentle silence settled once more across the shadowed clearing. The prophet had answered every question Odysseus carried into the land of the dead. The path home had been revealed, together with every danger waiting along it, and even the distant conclusion of a life still unfinished. Slowly the blind seer stepped back from the sacred trench, his awareness beginning to fade as the power granted by the sacrificial blood quietly diminished. Within moments his pale form merged, once again with the countless silent spirits surrounding the clearing, disappearing into the endless mist of Hades. But before another soul could approach the offering, a familiar figure quietly emerged from the shadows, someone Odysseus never expected to see. Again, she moved slowly, her face carrying both tenderness and sorrow. At first, he could scarcely believe his own eyes. Standing before him, beneath the eternal twilight of the underworld, was the spirit of his beloved mother, Anticlea. For a long moment, Odysseus simply stood motionless. The countless spirits surrounding the sacred trench slowly faded from his awareness. As his eyes remained fixed upon the gentle figure now approaching through the pale mist, every instinct urged him to call out her name, yet no sound escaped his lips. The impossible sight before him left him suspended somewhere between hope and sorrow. The woman walking quietly toward him wore the familiar features he had carried. Within his memory for nearly 20 years, her movements possessed the same quiet grace he remembered from his childhood in Ithaca. Even beneath the dim twilight of the underworld, there remained something unmistakably maternal in the calm expression resting upon her face. It was his mother, Anticlea, when Odysseus had sailed away to fight beneath the walls of Troy. She had still been alive. Every difficult year since then, through battles, storms, monsters, and endless wandering, he had comforted himself with the belief that somewhere across the sea his mother continued waiting beside Penelope and his young son Telemachus. Never once had he imagined that death had already carried her into this silent kingdom long before he himself arrived. The realization struck him with a sadness deeper than any wound received in battle. Throughout the Odyssey, Homer repeatedly reminds us that war steals far more than lives upon the battlefield. While soldiers fight in distant lands, time continues moving quietly at home. Children become adults, friends grow old, parents weaken with every passing season. The greatest tragedies often occur unseen, unfolding quietly in places far removed from heroic songs. Odysseus had survived Troy itself, yet he had not been there to comfort his mother during the final years of her life. That absence, more than any monster or storm, now weighed heavily upon his heart. Remembering Tiresias' instructions, however, Odysseus forced himself to remain where he stood. Every part of him longed to rush forward, to embrace the woman who had given him life, but he knew that the ancient rituals of the underworld demanded patience. Until Anticlea herself had tasted the sacrificial blood, she would remain little more than a wandering shade, unable to think or speak with full awareness. Slowly she approached the trench, her transparent hands trembling almost imperceptibly. Like every other soul in Hades, she seemed drawn toward the offering by a longing beyond words. Odysseus quietly lowered the point of his bronze sword, allowing only his mother's spirit to come forward. Kneeling beside the trench, Anticlea gently drank from the dark blood. Almost immediately, color seemed to return not to her body, for no spirit could truly recover life but to her expression. Recognition slowly awakened within her eyes. She lifted her head, looked directly toward the living man standing before her, and for the first time since her death, memory fully returned. "My son," the words emerged softly, almost like a whisper carried upon the wind. "My dear Odysseus, how have you come to this place while still among the living?" Those simple words carried more warmth than any welcome he had received since leaving Ithaca to decades earlier. Odysseus immediately fell to one knee before her, his voice trembling despite every attempt to remain composed. He explained the long years of wandering, the destruction of his fleet, the anger of Poseidon, the kindness of Circe, and the prophecy that had brought him into the kingdom of Hades. Yet even while speaking, another question burned constantly within his mind. He had to know, how had his mother died? When at last he found the strength to ask, Anticlea's expression became wonderfully peaceful. "No illness carried me away," she replied gently. "No enemy harmed me. No disease consumed my body." She paused for a long moment before continuing. "It was longing for you, my son." Those words remain among the most heartbreaking ever written within ancient Greek literature. Anticlea explained that after Odysseus departed for Troy, she had waited faithfully through every passing year, believing that one day the familiar sails of his ship would appear upon the horizon. At first came news of victories before Troy, then silence followed. Seasons passed into years. Rumors reached Ithaca, yet none brought certainty. Every sunrise awakened fresh hope. Every sunset carried fresh disappointment. Gradually, the endless waiting became heavier than her aging body could endure. She had watched Telemachus grow from a child into a young man without his father's guidance. She had witnessed Penelope spending night after night, weaving and unweaving her famous shroud, while arrogant suitors slowly consumed Odysseus' household. Each passing month deepened the fear that her beloved son had already perished somewhere beneath distant skies. In the end, Anticlea said quietly, grief itself had become stronger than life. Modern readers sometimes wonder whether Homer intended this literally or poetically. The ancient Greeks understood something modern medicine also recognizes in different language. Great sorrow can slowly weaken even the strongest heart. Long periods of loneliness, uncertainty, and emotional suffering often leave invisible wounds no less real than physical injury. Homer transforms that timeless human experience into one of the Odyssey's most touching moments. Anticlea does not die dramatically. She simply grows weary of hoping. For Odysseus, the revelation proved almost unbearable. He had faced Cyclopes without trembling. He had stood before Circe with drawn sword. He had crossed into the kingdom of the dead itself. Yet nothing prepared him for the knowledge that his own mother had died, believing she would never again see her son. Silence settled between them. Only the quiet murmur of the dark rivers disturbed the stillness surrounding the clearing. After a while, Anticlea gently smiled, as though wishing to ease the guilt filling her son's heart. "This was never your fault," she said softly. "You walked the path the gods placed before you." Then, seeing the questions still remaining within his eyes, she continued speaking of Ithaca. Penelope, she explained, remained astonishingly faithful despite the endless pressure surrounding her. Day after day she resisted the noblemen who crowded Odysseus' palace, refusing to choose another husband, while hope, however small, still survived. Young Telemachus had grown into a thoughtful and courageous man, though forced to mature far earlier than any son should. Old Laertes, Odysseus' father, no longer lived comfortably within the royal palace. Instead, overcome by grief, he spent his days working quietly among his orchards and vineyards, wearing simple clothes like an ordinary farmer rather than the father of a king. Each piece of news filled Odysseus with both relief and sorrow. His family still lived. They had not forgotten him, but every one of them carried the heavy burden of his absence. At last, unable to resist any longer, Odysseus stepped forward. Surely, he thought, even in this strange land, a son might embrace his own mother. He stretched out both arms. For a brief instant, Anticlea smiled exactly as she had when he was a child. Then his hands passed straight through her. There was no warmth, no heartbeat, no familiar embrace, only empty air. The spirit drifted gently backward like morning mist slipping through open fingers. Startled, Odysseus tried again. Once more, his arms closed around nothing. A third time he reached for her. Again she vanished through his grasp like smoke carried upon the wind. Homer describes the moment with extraordinary tenderness, comparing the soul to a dream or a shadow, something that appears vividly before the eyes, yet can never truly be held. It is perhaps the Odyssey's most profoundly human scene. The greatest warrior of Ithaca, the man who had outwitted monsters, survived impossible storms, and crossed alive into the kingdom of the dead, discovered that there existed one battle no courage could ever win. No living person could hold someone who had already crossed beyond the reach of life. Standing silently beneath the endless twilight of Hades, Odysseus slowly lowered his empty arms. For the first time since leaving Troy, he truly understood everything he had lost. As our journey through the shadowed kingdom of Hades gently comes to an end, it's time for us to leave the world of the dead behind, at least for tonight. Odysseus has received the prophecy that may finally guide him home, but his greatest trials are still waiting beyond the horizon. Ahead lies the irresistible song of the sirens, the terrifying passage between Scylla and Charybdis, the sacred cattle of Helios, the lonely island of Calypso, and at last the long-awaited return to Ithaca, where one final battle will decide the fate of his kingdom and his family. Those final chapters of the Odyssey deserve to be told with the same slow, peaceful journey we've shared together so far. So rather than rushing toward the ending, we'll save the rest of Odysseus' incredible adventure for our next video. Until then, thank you for joining me on tonight's voyage through one of the greatest stories ever told. If you enjoyed this relaxing journey through ancient Greece, I'd be truly grateful if you subscribed and joined me for the final chapter of Odysseus' legendary adventure. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your mind drift peacefully across the calm waters of the ancient Mediterranean. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and I'll see you in the final part of the Odyssey.